When the homeowner association tried to clear my family's land for their fancy resort project, they had no idea I had spent many months planning a clever trap. They fell for my bait completely, but how did I use their own greed to create the sweetest victory our neighborhood had ever seen? The paper cut from the official community group letter stung my finger as I stood at my mailbox, but the words inside hurt even more. It read, "After reviewing community boundaries, your back acre has been reclassified as common property." I read it twice with trembling hands. That land had been in my family for 3 generations. I walked straight to Alice Carter's house. She was our new community president with her flawless garden and even more flawless smile. When she answered the door wearing workout clothes and showing clear irritation, I said, "Can I help you, Ryan? This letter says you're taking my land. There must be some mistake." I tried to keep my voice calm. Alice's smile did not reach her eyes. "No mistake," she replied. "Our expert survey shows your grandfather's hand-drawn maps were wrong. The board voted unanimously last night. And by the way, you've been paying taxes on that land for 15 years. She examined her neatly painted nails. "The community rules don't require us to notify you about property corrections. We're planning a wonderful resort-style pool for everyone, even you." I was about to argue when loud music burst from next door, coming from the Stevens yard. Suddenly, Alice's smile became genuine. "I have to go now. Ben and Emily are hosting the neighborhood welcome party. You should come. It might help you get used to the changes." On my way home, the music grew louder through the fence. I saw my neighbors Ben and Emily laughing with their friends by a brand new pool that had been built very near my property line. That night I couldn't sleep because the bass thumped until 1 a.m. I tried calling Ben twice, but he didn't answer. At 1:15 a.m., I knocked on their door. Ben answered, his face red and holding a beer. "Hey man, the party's over. What's up? It's almost 1:30, and some of us have work tomorrow." Emily appeared behind him. "We stopped the music right at 1, but if you can hear people talking, then it's still too loud." Ben interrupted. "Alice said everything is fine until 1 o'clock. It's not our problem." "Speaking of Alice," I said, "did you know about the plan for my back acre?" Their guilty looks told me everything. "You knew they were stealing my land," Emily corrected softly. "Not stealing, but reallocating. The resort will have a lap pool for serious swimmers, cabanas, and even a cocktail bar on my property." Ben shrugged. "It's not personal. Alice showed us the real property lines. Your grandfather's maps were wrong." At home that night, I couldn't sleep. I pulled out my grandpa's old wooden chest from the attic. Inside were the original property documents, yellowed with age. I spread them on the kitchen table under a lamp and compared them to the modern survey Alice had attached to her letter. Something did not add up. Grandpa's boundaries had been drawn along natural features: the creek, the old oak tree, the rocky ridge, whereas the community group's map ignored these and drew straight lines that conveniently cut off my favorite acre. I noticed some small writing in the corner of Grandpa's deed that I had never paid attention to before. It mentioned county survey markers from 1952. If those markers still existed, a plan began to form in my mind. I needed help, so I scrolled through my phone contacts until I found Alex Johnson, a surveyor who had worked with my father years ago. I texted him even though it was 3 a.m. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove to the county records office. My cousin Liam worked there, and I needed access to the original surveys. "These community people are getting bolder every year," Liam muttered as we sifted through dusty files. "Ah, here it is. The 1952 survey clearly shows my property extended beyond what I had thought. The creek moved after a flood in the 70s, but property lines don't move with the creek." Then my phone buzzed with a text from Alice. "Community announcement, groundbreaking for Pinecrest Resort begins Tuesday. Please clear any personal items from the designated area." Alice Carter. That text gave me 5 days to act. On my way home, I drove past the Stevens house and saw workers setting up an even bigger speaker system by their pool. Ben waved cheerfully as I passed. That afternoon, Alex arrived with his equipment. "Let's find those original markers," he said. "If they're still there, the community group has a big problem." We worked until sunset, staying hidden behind my shed and the tall, overgrown grass. Alex's metal detector soon found the first marker. His eyebrows shot up. "According to this, your property extends another 50 feet over here. That even includes part of the Stevens' new pool." We found 3 more markers before dark. Each confirmed what Grandpa's maps had shown. My land was actually larger than I had been keeping. "There's more," Alex said quietly. "See this ridge? The geological survey from the 50s notes it as a potential archaeological site. They found Native American artifacts here in the 1940s. I remembered Grandpa's stories about arrowheads and pottery pieces. I always thought they were just tales." "What does that mean legally?" I asked. "If it's confirmed, it could trigger a historical preservation review, and no development would be allowed." That night, another party started next door. I smiled as the music blasted. Let them enjoy it while they can. My doorbell rang around 8 p.m. It was Rose Anderson, my 80-year-old neighbor from across the street, carrying a casserole. "I thought you might need some dinner with all that commotion next door," she said. I invited her in and told her everything. Rose listened carefully, then said, "Alice has been pulling these tricks for years. She forced the Hendersons out last summer with fake violations. Their house is now in her daughter's name. Why doesn't anyone stop her? She's friends with the mayor's wife." Her eyes twinkled. "I taught high school history for 40 years and volunteered at the county museum. I know a lot about archaeological preservation. This land means more than just money. It's our history." "Then fight for it," I replied. Later that night, my phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. "Meeting tomorrow at 7 a.m. at Alice's house. Bringing contractors for pool placement on your acre. Don't tell Ryan." My heart pounded. They weren't waiting until Tuesday. I set my alarm for 5 a.m. I needed to be ready before they arrived. I woke before sunrise, gulped down some coffee, and prepared. Alex arrived in an unmarked truck with equipment hidden under tarps. "If our markers are right," he whispered in the dim light as we worked. "The community survey missed nearly 2 acres of your land." I soaked my jeans as we hammered in flags exactly where Grandpa's deed indicated. With each stake, my confidence grew. The last marker went directly through the corner of Ben and Emily's fancy new deck, built just last month. "Convenient timing," I told Alex. "Not just convenient," he replied while checking his GPS. "According to county permits, they built that deck after the community group's new survey, almost like they knew where the new boundary would be." He showed me his tablet with the official report. The survey completely ignored the original path of the creek before the 1978 flood. "No professional would make that mistake accidentally," he added. As the sun rose higher, we heard vehicles approaching. "Hide the equipment," I whispered. From behind my garden shed, we watched as Alice arrived with 3 other board members and a landscaping crew. They unloaded spray paint and measuring tools, laughing as they marked locations for cabanas, a tiki bar, and a large pool, all on my property. "This spa feature will be perfect right here," Alice said, marking a big X through my grandmother's rose garden, which I had cared for over the past 20 years. I wanted to confront them, but Alex held me back. "Not yet. We need more evidence." That morning, I visited the local historical society where my mother had once volunteered. The director, Susan, greeted me warmly. "Your timing is interesting," she said as she pulled out a folder. "Someone from the county just requested all records about your property. Alice's actions made Susan nod slowly. She seemed very interested to know if any historical claims had ever been made. I explained my situation, and Susan's face darkened. This happened in Meadowbrook, too. Their community president, who works for the same development company as Alice, turned half the neighborhood into vacation rentals after forcing original owners out. Now I understood that this wasn't just about a pool. It was about property values and big development deals. I need proof of the archaeological significance, I said. Susan smiled and said, "Your grandfather actually donated some artifacts he found on your land." She brought out a small box containing arrowheads and pottery fragments. They were cataloged but never fully examined. "I can arrange for an expert assessment back home," she offered. I found Rose in her garden across the street. "I know," I told her. "I've been taking pictures every hour." Rose showed me her phone. "Documentation is key," she said. That afternoon, I called Liam again. "I need two things: the emergency historical preservation filing process and any information on Alice Carter's business connections." While waiting for Liam's callback, I noticed Ben watching me from his yard. "Hey, neighbor," he called cheerfully, excited about the new resort project. I walked to the fence. "Why did you build your deck after the community survey but before announcing the new boundaries?" I asked. His smile faltered. "The permit for your deck was filed one day after Alice's survey. What an odd coincidence." "Look," I replied, "we are only following the official property lines." Ben stuttered. "The official lines include those 1952 markers I saw this morning. One's right under your hot tub." His face drained of color as he muttered something about needing to make a call before hurrying inside. Within minutes, my phone rang. It was Alice. "Ryan, I hear you have concerns about the community project. Why don't you come over so we can discuss them?" Her voice was as sweet as honey, but then she added, "I would prefer to talk when everyone is here." "How about a special community meeting?" I asked. "That's not necessary. This is already decided," she snapped. "Then here's my next step." "Are you threatening me?" I replied. Her voice hardened. "I'm just following proper procedures, like documenting the original boundary markers. Your survey somehow missed them." I said, "They're the markers from 1952 that Alex found this morning." I could almost hear her mind racing. "Those old markers are not relevant to modern surveys," she said. "The county assessor disagrees with you. I just spoke with them." After a long pause, she added, "We'll discuss this tomorrow. Meanwhile, stay off the common areas." "You mean my property?" I shot back. "I plan to use all of it." I ended the call feeling stronger than I had in weeks. Liam called me back immediately. "You hit a nerve," he said. "Alice just requested emergency access to all your property records. It's too late for her. I've already flagged your parcel with a preliminary historical review notice. Nothing can be developed while that is pending." That evening, I invited Rose and Alex over to plan our next steps. We spread maps all over my kitchen table. Just then, headlights swept across the windows, and someone was at the door. Rose peeked through the curtains. "It's Alice and the Stevens," she said. Before I could reply, my phone pinged with messages from neighbors. "Are you okay?" And, "I saw Alice heading to your place with the sheriff." Ben was telling everyone that I had threatened him. Alex looked grim. "They're escalating and trying to intimidate you. Let them try," I said. I gathered all our evidence into a folder when the doorbell rang again, followed by heavy knocking. I opened the door to find Alice, Ben, Emily, and a uniformed man standing there. "Good evening, folks," I said calmly. "What brings you here so late?" Alice stepped forward. "Ryan, this is Deputy Harris. We are concerned about your erratic behavior today." Ben quickly added, "You threatened me in front of my family." I was stunned. "That's completely false." Deputy Harris looked uncomfortable. "Sir, I understand there's a property dispute, But threatening neighbors is a serious matter, I interrupted. In fact, I have witnesses to our conversation. Look at Rose's house. Her security camera faces my yard. The deputy's expression changed. Alice then said smoothly, "This isn't just about today. We are concerned about your mental state. You are making wild claims about property lines that were settled years ago." I laughed. "Wild?" I countered. "I've been obsessed with boundaries since we moved in. I only complain about noise because you built on my land and partied until 1 a.m. The deputy raised his hands. "Okay, let's slow down, everyone. This sounds like a civil matter, not a criminal one." Alice was not ready to give up. "You've been digging up the community land without permission and damaging the landscaping." I opened the folder and handed the deputy copies of Alex's survey report, the original deed, and photos of the 1952 markers. These documents prove that the community group's survey is wrong. They're trying to take nearly 2 acres of my legal property. The deputy reviewed the papers while Alice fumed silently. Finally, he said, "Ma'am, this appears to be a genuine property dispute that needs to be handled in court, not through police intervention. I suggest both parties contact their attorneys." As they turned to leave, I called out, "Alice, one more thing. You might want to tell your friends at Lakeside Development that the county has started a historical preservation review of my property effective immediately." Alice froze, then spun around. "How did you know about that?" she asked, but she quickly caught herself. It was too late. The deputy looked between us, clearly sensing more was going on. "Have a good night," he said. I answered pleasantly and closed the door on Alice's shocked face. Inside, Rose, Alex, and I exchanged looks of triumph. We all knew this was only the beginning. "They'll come back with lawyers next," Alex warned. "Let them try," I replied, tapping the folder. "We have the truth on our side." Rose smiled slightly. "Tomorrow will bring even more. I've arranged for an archaeologist friend to examine those artifacts Susan found." My phone buzzed with a text from Liam. "Found the connection. Alice's husband is the CFO at Lakeside Development. They just filed plans for vacation rentals in your neighborhood." Another piece of the puzzle fit in place. This wasn't just about a pool. They wanted my land as part of a bigger commercial development. "We need to warn the neighbors," I said. "Already happening," Rose replied, showing me her phone where a neighborhood chat group was exploding with messages about Alice's development connections. A final text arrived from an unknown number. "Community emergency meeting called for 7 a.m. tomorrow. All board members must attend. Code read." Alex laughed. "Looks like someone's panicking." I should have felt relieved, but something still bothered me. They were not giving up easily. Alice had too much invested, as if she had been summoned by my words. Suddenly, the lights across my backyard blazed on. Massive construction lights mounted on the Stevens property aimed directly at my house. The glare was blinding, pouring through every window. "What's that?" Alex asked. Rose peered through the brightness. "There's someone by your shed, squinting against the light," she said. I could just make out figures moving on my property, and I realized they were removing my boundary flags. The heavy machinery's rumble jolted me awake at 4:30 a.m. I scrambled to my window and saw a huge yellow bulldozer creeping toward my back acre. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone, the deed papers, and a flashlight. I raced outside in my slippers. "Stop right now!" I shouted, waving my flashlight wildly. The bulldozer's headlights blinded me as it kept moving. Its metal blade gleamed in the dim pre-dawn darkness. The operator, a tired-looking man in a hard hat, finally cut the engine. "Look, buddy, I'm just following orders. I have paperwork here that says this is community property." "Well, your paperwork is wrong," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite my pounding heart. My grandfather's warnings about watching our property lines echoed in my mind. Headlights swept across my yard as 3 vehicles pulled up. Alice stepped out of her white Range Rover wearing a smart pantsuit, even though it was very early. She was followed by the Stevens and 2 men I didn't recognize, all carrying briefcases. "Mr. Parker," Alice called out with a tight smile, "I see you're up early too. Enjoy watching the groundbreaking ceremony." I held up my phone. "I already called Sheriff Thompson. You are trespassing on private property." Alice unfolded a document from her leather portfolio. "According to the county survey we commissioned, this land falls within community boundaries. We are being quite generous with the compensation package." Ben Stevens snickered behind her. "Time to join the team, Parker. The resort will boost all our property values." I stood my ground, feeling the damp grass between my toes. "I filed an emergency injunction yesterday. This land has been in my family for 3 generations, and I have the original survey markers to prove it." Alice's perfectly plucked eyebrows raised slightly. "An injunction? How inconvenient." She turned to one of the suited men. "Henry, call Judge Watkins if necessary." Just then, the distant wail of a police siren cut through the tension. Sheriff Thompson, my father's old fishing buddy, pulled up in his patrol car, looking irritated. "What's going on here?" he asked, adjusting his belt as he approached. Alice stepped forward with an outstretched hand. "Good morning, Sheriff. It's just a small misunderstanding about property lines. Nothing to worry about." I raised my voice. "No, it's not nothing. They are trying to steal my land." Sheriff Thompson looked between us. "Ma'am, do you have permits for that machinery to operate before 7 a.m. and construction permits for what you're planning?" Alice's smile faltered. "We have community group authorization." "That's not what I asked," Sheriff Thompson said. "County ordinance says no construction before 7 a.m. in residential areas, and I don't see any permits posted." While they argued, I noticed Rose, my 78-year-old neighbor, walking toward us with a stack of old yellowed papers. She had been on the original community board 30 years ago before she retired. Alice called out, "Rose?" Rose's voice was stronger than her frail frame suggested. "You might want to see these before you make a terrible mistake." Alice dismissed her with a wave. "Not now, Rose." But Rose ignored her and handed the papers to me. "Your grandfather and I planned for something like this many years ago. The community group tried the same trick in '89 with the Henderson property." I skimmed the original meeting minutes. They showed that the true boundaries had been officially recorded with the state, not just the county. "I'd like to file harassment charges, and I want all of you and your equipment off my property immediately," I declared. Alice's phone buzzed, and she stepped away to answer it. Her face darkened as she listened. When she returned, her voice lost its edge. "There appears to be a paperwork conflict," she announced to her group. "We'll postpone today's work to sort out these technicalities." The bulldozer operator looked relieved as he climbed down. "So, no work today. Pack it up," Alice snapped, and they reluctantly retreated. I noticed several neighbors had gathered at the edge of my property, watching the scene unfold. Some recorded everything on their phones. Alice noticed too. Her eyes narrowed as she walked to her car. "This isn't over, Mr. Parker," she said. "The board will vote tomorrow on invoking our emergency powers clause. I suggest you prepare a reasonable counteroffer." Sheriff Thompson waited until they drove away before turning to me. "Your dad always said the community group would try something like this after he passed." I nodded. "Okay," I said, suddenly feeling the weight of fighting this battle alone. "I'll be fine, but I need to prepare for tomorrow." Rose patted my arm. "You're not alone, dear. Some of us remember how this community started before people like Alice tried to turn it into their personal country club." As we stood in my yard watching the sunrise, my phone dinged with a text from Alex. Found something big in the county archives. Meet me at 9. Bring lots of coffee. I looked up at my neighbors, still lingering at the edge of my property. Some gave encouraging waves, while others turned away awkwardly. The battle lines were being drawn, and tomorrow's vote would decide exactly who stood where. Later that morning, as I pushed through the double doors of the Ridge Community Center, an assistant for Alice tried to block my way. "Get off my property," she said. I replied firmly, "I'm not leaving until I say so." Inside, the emergency community meeting had started 20 minutes early, another of Alice's tricks. "Actually, I can speak," I said, clutching my leather briefcase. Inside were the results of my long night of research with Alex, documents that could change everything. Heads turned as I marched down the center aisle. The room was packed with over 100 neighbors, some I'd known for decades, and others who had moved in more recently, drawn by Alice's promises of a resort-style community upgrade. Alice stood at the podium, her bright red lipstick matching her blazer. As I began to speak, she interrupted. "The vote to invoke our Community Enhancement Clause requires a 2/3 majority before anyone votes," she stated. "You should know exactly what you are voting on," I announced loudly. Alice's perfectly manicured fingers are tightening around that microphone. "Mr. Parker, you're out of order. We are following Robert's rules here," she snapped. "Funny you mention rules," I said, opening my briefcase. "I spent the night discovering just how many you've broken." Whispers rippled through the crowd. I spotted the Stevens in the front row, Ben nervously adjusting his collar. Rose gave me an encouraging nod. "Point of order," I said. "The agenda does not allow for changes without proper notice. Section 5 of your own rules requires 72 hours notice for an emergency meeting with no changes allowed after distribution." Henry, one of Alice's lawyer friends, fell silent as several neighbors murmured in agreement. I stepped up to the front table where the board sat. "I request 10 minutes to present relevant information before any vote takes place." Board member Diana Lee, who had always been fair despite her friendship with Alice, said, "I move that we allow Mr. Parker to speak." Several voices seconded her motion. Alice's face tightened, but she stepped aside. "All right, 10 minutes." I spread out 3 large maps on the presentation table. This first document is the original 1952 survey of Maple Ridge. It shows the natural creek boundary that defined my family's property. I pointed to the winding blue line on the map, where the creek formed a natural border between private and common land. But during the flood of 1978, the creek shifted. Alice interrupted. "Our recent survey, your survey," I continued calmly, "conveniently ignores the original boundary markers, which state law recognizes as the legal definition even if natural features change." I then unveiled Alex's new certified survey, which showed red boundary lines extending far beyond what the community group claimed. According to state law and county records, my property includes all of this area, which unfortunately for some of you means it also includes land you thought was yours. Gasps erupted among the neighbors. "That's impossible," Ben Stevens sputtered, his face growing pale. "Unfortunately not," I replied. "Your swimming pool extends 12 feet onto my legal property, and Alice's home addition from last spring goes 18 feet over the line." All eyes turned to Alice, whose composed look cracked for the first time. "This is absurd. Our survey was done by your brother-in-law's company," she argued. I finished my presentation by pointing out a clear conflict of interest, which I have now filed as an ethics complaint with the state licensing board. I handed copies to every board member. Then I reached into my briefcase and carefully removed a small plastic bag containing what looked like stone arrowheads. Yesterday, during our survey, we discovered these artifacts. The county archaeologist has preliminarily dated them to about 800 years ago. I have already filed for historical preservation status, which means no development can happen within 200 feet of the discovery site. This effectively covers my entire property. Rose stood and slowly walked to the front. I was there when these were uncovered, she said softly. As an amateur archaeologist, I recognized their importance immediately. Alice's lawyer leaned in urgently, and Alice shoved him away. "This is just a delay tactic," she hissed. "We have investors waiting. Contracts have been signed." Her words hung heavy in the air. Board member Diana Lee leaned forward. "What investors? The board hasn't approved any contracts." Alice's face fell as she realized her mistake. Then the room erupted in questions. "Order! Order!" Alice shouted, banging her gavel so hard that a piece broke off. I continued. "While researching property records, I discovered something else. 3 months ago, Alice and her husband created an LLC called Ridgeline Development Partners. 2 weeks later, this LLC bought the vacant lot next door, which would greatly increase in value if a resort were built nearby." Board member Frank Roberts' eyes widened. "You told us you sold that property to your cousin," he exclaimed. "That is a character attack," Alice snarled. "No, it's public record," I replied calmly. Diana Lee then stood and said, "I move that we adjourn this meeting and suspend all actions regarding the proposed development until a full investigation of these allegations can be completed." Several voices seconded her motion. "You can't do this," Alice shouted. "We have deadlines." Frank asked, "What deadlines? And what contracts are you talking about?" As the board members turned on each other, I noticed Ben Stevens slipping out a side door with his phone pressed to his ear. Alice saw me watching him, and something cold came into her eyes. "This isn't over, Alex, not by a long shot," she said. After the meeting dissolved into chaos, Diana Lee approached me. "You should know that Alice has been talking to city officials about rezoning this entire area. Whatever game she's playing, it's bigger than just your property." I nodded, suddenly understanding why Alice had been so aggressive. "Thank you for the warning." As neighbors crowded around me with questions, my phone vibrated with a text from Alex. "Don't celebrate yet. I found building permits filed under a different company name. They're going after Rose's property next. Meet me at the county office ASAP." I looked across the room where Alice huddled with Henry and 2 board members. Despite her setback, she wore a slight smile. Whatever she has planned, I thought, this battle is far from over. Just then, I shouted from outside, "Get off my property!" as Alice's fancy car pulled into my driveway, kicking up gravel. The entire board of the community group spilled out like angry hornets from a disturbed nest. My heart pounded, but I planted my feet firmly on my porch steps. "We need to talk," Alice said, her voice icier than winter. She clutched a leather folder so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Your little stunt at the meeting has forced us to involve our attorneys." Behind her stood a nervous man in an expensive suit who kept checking his watch. "Mr. Peterson, our legal counsel," she mumbled, barely looking at me. I crossed my arms and replied, "Funny, I was about to call my lawyer, the county assessor, and maybe even the local news station." Alice's face twitched. The other board members exchanged worried glances. "Perhaps we could discuss this inside," Mr. Peterson suggested in a cracking voice. "I'm done with secret meetings and backroom deals," I said firmly. Mrs. Ramirez from next door, who had been watering her flowers and eavesdropping, looked up. Rose had already positioned her lawn chair on her porch with a clear view of my yard. Even old Mr. Jenkins had his window open with his hearing aid turned up high. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat. "We have reviewed your documentation. The board is prepared to make a reasonable offer." I raised an eyebrow and asked, "And what is that offer?" Alice said through clenched teeth, "We drop all claims to your property." I laughed. You mean you drop your illegal home addition and the Stevens pool that crosses my property line by 8 feet? That's your big offer? Board member Keith Miller insisted. It's more than fair. And what about the bulldozer that nearly destroyed my garden? The noise violations, the threats, and the lies to the community about my land? I pressed. Mr. Peterson stepped forward, lowering his voice. Be reasonable. We could settle this in court for years. You can try, I replied. I pulled out my phone. I recorded Alice giving orders to start construction before the approved date, and I have statements from 3 contractors who were told to ignore the property markers. Alice lunged forward. You can't prove that, she shouted. I have copies of emails where you discussed how to pressure me into selling, I continued, watching her face pale. My cousin in county records found those quite interesting. Did you know that properly filed community documents become public record after 7 years? The tension in the room was thick. Mr. Peterson then whispered urgently to Alice, whose perfectly styled hair seemed to droop with each passing second. What do you want? She finally asked. I've been waiting for that question, I said calmly. First, a binding agreement with severe penalties if broken. Second, the leisure center must be built on the actual common land by the front entrance. Third, revised noise rules with real enforcement. Fourth, you must make a public apology at the next meeting. Fifth, I want a position on the Architectural Review Committee. And finally, a fund set up for property line verification for every home in the neighborhood, paid for by the community reserves. Impossible! Alice exploded. We'd have to raise dues or cut my executive compensation, I suggested with a smile. It's your choice. The group huddled together and whispered frantically. Mr. Peterson kept shaking his head, while Alice jabbed her finger at my house. Mrs. Ramirez had stopped gardening and was now openly watching, and Rose gave me a thumbs up from her porch. After what felt like forever, Alice marched back, her designer heels sinking into my lawn. Fine, she spat, extending her hand. But this agreement includes a non-disclosure clause. No one hears about what happened here. I shook her cold hand firmly. Too late for that, I said. The neighbors have already heard everything. As they shuffled back to their cars, board member Keith whispered to Alice. Why did we agree to all this? Alice hissed. Because he didn't mention the tax reassessment that would happen if he reported the correct property lines to the county. We'd all be ruined. I smiled to myself. I hadn't even thought of that angle. Sometimes the best victories come when you let your enemies imagine their worst.